Hello, everyone. Today I want to talk about variable scope and nested for loop in PHP. And what I'm going to talk about today might not apply to other languages like JavaScript. What I'm going to talk about today is specific to PHP. So let's get started. So first, I want to create a variable called a, and I want to store one into it, and then I just want to echo out that variable. So obviously this prints out one. Okay, so that's good. And next thing I want to do is I still want to keep this code, and then I'm going to create a function, and then I'm going to call that test, and then inside that function, I'm going to use a variable called a, and I'm going to store 2 inside it. And then I'm going to call that function, and then I'm going to echo out that variable. So what do you think will happen? Is it going to print out 1 or is it going to print out 2? So let's test it out. So it prints out 1 and not 2. So the reason why is so I'm using a variable here, and it's used inside this function. This function is something that I created, a user created. So this is variable used inside a user-defined function. And a variable used inside a user-defined function is limited to the scope of that function. So what that means is that from outside this user-defined function, user cannot access this variable. So I'm calling the function here. So that means 2 is stored in a variable called a. But when I echo out variable called a, from here, I cannot access this variable. So that's why it's echoing out 1. Okay. So I want to change things up again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say echo and then variable called a, and call that function here. So what do you think will happen? So it prints out 2. Okay. Because I'm storing 2 inside a variable called a, and I'm echoing out that variable. Okay, cool. So what happens if I get rid of this? What do you think will happen? Do you think it's gonna echo out 1? So let's test it out. So it says no output. Okay. So again, the reason why is so this variable that I'm trying to echo out is used inside this function, user-defined function. And as I said earlier, a variable used inside a user-defined function is limited to the scope of that function. This variable is effective only inside these curly brackets. And inside these curly brackets, no value is stored inside of it. Um, so that's why nothing is printed out here. And so if I want to echo out this variable inside this function, um, in other words, if I want to access variable that sits outside a user-defined function from uh, inside within a user-defined function, what I need to do is I need to say global, and then I want to say the name of the variable. So by writing this, I'm saying, okay, I want to access this variable here. When I say variable A, I want that to mean that I want to use this variable. Okay, so when I save and run this code, it echoes out 1 because now I have access to this global variable. Okay, cool. Okay, so I want to change things up a little bit again, and I want to use if statement. So, so inside curly brackets, I just want to echo out A. Okay. So what do you think will happen? Let's test it out, and it prints out 1. Okay. So what I got confused, maybe you guys probably don't get confused about this, but this variable called a is inside curly brackets, but that doesn't mean that this variable is used inside a user-defined function. If statement is not the same as user-defined function, right? It's just an if statement. So without doing anything, we have access to this variable here, global variable. So without any problem, we can echo out 1. Okay, so I'm gonna, instead of using if statement, I'm gonna use for loop. Okay, so let's see, 0, 2. I'm gonna just write code here and echo out. Let's echo out. I'm gonna get rid of this. Let's echo out just I, and then okay, cool. So I'm using for loop. So what for loop does is that first 0 gets stored inside a variable called I, and then it checks whether this is true or not. And so in this case, 0 is smaller than 2, so this becomes true. So when the condition is met, it executes the code inside curly brackets. So it's gonna echo out 0 and then in a space. And then after executing the code here, the variable called I gets incremented and it becomes 1. And then again checks this statement here. Is 1 smaller than 2? Yes, it's true. So it's gonna echo out, it's gonna execute this code again. Okay, and after that, the variable I gets incremented again, so it becomes 2. and then checks this here, checks this, is 2 smaller than 2? No, it's false. So when this condition becomes false, um, it returns us back here. Okay, so let's save and run it, and it's gonna echo at 0 and 1. So that's cool. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to create for loop inside for loop. So we're gonna have an outer loop and we're gonna have an inner loop. So and the point is whether I can use the same variable or the same counter for the outer loop and for the inner loop. And first I'm going to use a different counter. So I'm going to use j instead of I here. Okay, and then j is smaller than 2. And after executing the code inside, j gets incremented by 1. And inside the inner for loop, I'm going to say, I'm going to just say a, and then space. Okay, cool. So first let's save and then run this code. Okay, so it prints out 4a. Okay, so let's go over what just happened. Okay, so we start with the outer loop. So first 0 gets stored inside I, and it checks this. Is I smaller than 2? Yes, 0 is smaller than 2. So when it becomes true, it executes the code inside. And the code inside is for loop. And what it does is it stores 0 inside variable j, and then it checks this statement. Is j smaller than 2? Yes, 0 is smaller than 2, so it executes the code here. So we have this first a, okay, and then j gets incremented by 1 and it becomes 1. And it checks the statement, is 1 smaller than 2? True. So it echoes out a here. So we have the second a, and j gets incremented again, it becomes 2. Is 2 smaller than 2? False. So it doesn't execute the code here, and we are done with this for loop. So we're done executing the code inside this curly brackets of the outer loop. So I gets incremented and I becomes 1, and it checks the statement here. Is 1 smaller than 2? True. So we execute this inner for loop again. And what it does is it stores 0 again inside variable j and checks the statement again. Is 0 smaller than 2? True, so it echoes out 8. So we have the third a here. And then j gets incremented by 1, and it becomes 1. Is 1 smaller than 2? True, so it echoes out a. So we have our fourth a here. And j gets incremented again, it becomes 2. Is 2 smaller than 2? False. So it does not execute the code here, and we are done executing the code here, the inner for loop. And then I gets incremented by 1, it becomes 2. And it checks the statement here. Is 2 smaller than 2? False. So we're done with this entire for loop, the outer loop. And then it returns us back here. Okay, so that what's happened. And cool. So next I want to test if I can use the same variable for the outer loop and for the inner loops. So instead of using j for the inner loop, I'm going to use the same variable called I. So do you think it's going to work the same way or it works differently? So what we want is we want 4a's being echoed out. So let's just let's save and test it out. And it gives us just 2a's, not 4a's. So let's go over what happened. So first, 0 gets stored in variable I, and it checks the statement here, is I smaller than 2? And it's true, so we execute the code here. And so the point I want to make here is that, so I want to ask you a question. Do you guys see any user-defined function here? Do you guys see any user-defined function here? And the answer is no, right? We're using for loops, and that's not a user-defined function. It's just a for loop. So what that means is that if you remember what we were talking about earlier, if a variable is used inside a user-defined function, the variable is limited to only the scope of that function, but we don't have any user-defined function. So what that means is that this variable called I um, that sits in the outer for loop, and the variable here called I that sits in the inner for loop are basically treated as the same thing, right? So this I and this I are the same. So let's keep that in mind. And then 0 gets stored into I, which is fine because now this I has 0. And then it checks the statement here. Is I smaller than 2? True. So it echoes out A. So we have our first A here. Okay. And then in the inner loop, I gets incremented and it becomes 1. And it checks the statement here. Is I smaller than 2? True. So it echoes out A again. So we have our second A. And I gets incremented again and it becomes 2. And it checks the statement here. Is I smaller than 2? No. 2 is not smaller than 2. So it becomes false. So it does not execute the code here. And it returns us back to the outer loop. And here I gets incremented by 1. But what does the variable I have inside it? Which value? What value does the variable I have inside? It has 2 now, right? Because for the in the inner loop, we incremented variable I twice. So from 0 it became 1, and from 1 it became 2, and we just checked the statement here, and it became false because this variable called I has 2 inside of it, and 2 is not smaller than 2, so that's why it returned us back to the outer loop. So 2 gets incremented by 1 and it becomes 3. So, and we check the statement here. Is I smaller than 2? No, because now variable called I has 3. So 3 is not smaller than 2. So this becomes false. And then we're done with the entire code and it returns us back to here. So that's why we only have 2a's echoed out. Okay. And so another bad example I want to show is, I'm going to change here. I'm gonna say 5, for example. So let's think about what's going to happen here. So let's save and run this code to test it out. And it's taking a long time, and that's because I don't know if it's gonna echo out the result. Okay, let me go over what just happened. Okay, cool. So it's echoing out, and it's echoing out A's infinitely. Okay, so what's happening is that we just created an infinite loop. So let's go over what just happened. So first, 0 gets stored in variable called a, and then it checks the statement here, and 0 is smaller than 5, so it becomes true. So we execute the code here, and then 0 gets stored into I, and checks the statement here. Is 0 smaller than 2? True. So it echoes out a, and I gets incremented and it becomes 1. Is 1 smaller than 2? True. So it echoes out again. And I gets incremented and it becomes 2. Is 2 smaller than 2? No, false. So it returns us back here. And now I has 2, and then it gets incremented and it becomes 3, and checks the statement here. Is 3 smaller than 5? True. And what happens next is that now I has 3 inside of it, but because we execute the code, the inner for loop again, 0 gets stored into 1. And we do the same thing again. Is 0 smaller than 2? Yes, so it echoes out a, gets incremented. Is 1 smaller than 2? True, so it echoes out 8 again. And I gets incremented and it becomes 2. Is 2 smaller than 2? False, so it returns us back here. And 2 gets incremented and it becomes 3. And checks the statement. Is 3 smaller than 5? True. So we execute the code here again, and 0 gets stored again into I. So as you can see, this is an infinite loop because the inner loop here stores 0 inside I, and then it happens again and again and again and again. So this is an infinite loop, and it's not something that we want. So the point I want to make out is that because we don't have any user-defined function, basically this variable I and this variable I are basically treated as the same thing. So, and it's not good practice. So whenever you want to use a nested for loop inside another for loop, it's better practice if we use another variable for the inner for loop. So it's better practice if we use different variable for the as the counter for the inner loop. That's the point I want to make in this video. Okay, I hope that made sense. If you have any comments, please leave them below. Thank you for watching.